Greetings! My name is Michael, and you're about to learn why the stories you love are garbage. I've started this channel last February, and today's video rounds up the year for me, so I wanted to have some fun. And what can be funnier than a religious bigot who is on the other continent and isn't likely to cause you any physical harm? That's why today I decided to talk about Shadow of the Conqueror by Shad Brooks, aka Shadiversity. There are two problems here though. First is, I always go after stories that are popular. I even say it in the beginning of each video, including this one, stories you love. And nobody loves Shadow of the Conqueror.
The overall reception to it has been honestly overwhelming. Calculating all the sales of the book across every medium, which is ebook, paperback, and audiobook, I've sold over 40,000 copies.
I stand corrected. There is another problem here, and that is that I have not read the book. I did, however, read the free chapters available on Amazon. So I won't be talking about any of the creepy sex stuff that happens later. Yes, I do know about it, but it's not something I saw on a page. But don't worry, those opening chapters still give me plenty to talk about. Pretty much everything there is bad. So, let's begin. In those chapters, we are following this guy called Dalen, also called Dallas for some reason, who wants to die and constantly whines about it. Basically your typical emo. He prepares to leave his dwelling so that he can kill himself in the most spectacular way imaginable, and he takes enormous pleasure anticipating the turmoil that his passing would cause. Again, typical emo. But the really jarring bit here is Dalen's attitude towards his intimate parts. He seems to be convinced that every man who ever lived talked to his own nether regions at least once in his life. Which is, by the way, not true. And then he cracks a joke directed at his external reproductive organs. I don't know if it's something Shad does himself and thinks it normal, or it's something Shad thinks everybody else does, him being a rare exception. Both options are kinda disturbing. So, while waiting for his ride, Dalen meets that magical knight, or Lightbringer as they're called in this book, who is there to meet some young man he doesn't know. I'm pretty sure that even the most stupid readers figured out that mysterious unknown would be Dalen himself, after somehow getting his youth back. If it was an attempt at creating some kind of mystery, it failed. The Lightbringer serves no purpose in that scene. Well, that's not entirely true. He does some magic on Dalen, which temporarily makes him feel better. That impedes the following scenes because the book now has to tell us several times that whatever simple thing Dalen did, like getting into the car, he would not be able to do without a healing. It would be way better if he wasn't healed, actually failed to do those things, and had to accept others' help. Also, the Lightbringer says something like, "We try to bring as much brightness as we can bring, and that's why we're called bringers." Yes, he uses the word bring several times in a row. Now, Dalen says that as an attempt at humor it totally sucked, which, to be fair, is correct, but I don't really understand why he even thought it was supposed to be a joke. I guess it's at least on par with his own comedic talents. Then we're introduced to another character called Paragon, who is going to drive Dalen to the port so that he can get a ride to where he will finally off himself. If you think Dalen's plan is overly complicated, that's because it is. Anyway, Paradan eventually starts talking to his passenger after spending a few hours in comfortable silence, and Dalen reminds us how much he doesn't want to engage in this conversation and how grumpy he is before actually engaging in this conversation in a mildly friendly manner. Also, Dalen thinks back about his beloved sword that he left behind because he was too weak to carry it. Earlier, however, when we were still in Dalen's hut, we haven't seen that sword. It's like Shad forgot to describe the sword back then, but couldn't be bothered to rewrite that first scene. Also, if Dalen really wanted to have his sword with him as much as he says, he could probably wheel it in a barrel. He wouldn't even have to drag it himself. Dalen is an engineer, so he could easily build some primitive means of propulsion similar to ones used in Paradan's vehicle and, by the way, described in excruciating detail. Then Dalen reminisces about a war that he, being in power, waged against some other kingdom. Apparently he won, and executed all nobles in that other kingdom, so nobody could claim its throne. Which is not how it works. Pugachev's rebellion, for example, was led by some nobody who simply pretended to be the lawful king while not even being a nobleman. That's what would happen if you kill nobles, but don't do a lot more to squash any potential unrest. Somebody would just declare themselves a nobleman. After that brief historical excursion, Dalen observes the city defenses and thinks something profoundly stupid. Specifically, it's this. With a full-sized company of dragoons and a single battleship or warship, Dalen knew he could take the city in an hour. I am not a military expert, far from it. But logically, a castle with great fortifications won't stand a chance if it's defended by a single man. Conversely, a castle with terrible fortifications, whose walls are still standing only in a few places, whose moat is extremely shallow, and so on, can still be defended well by a large, professional, well-motivated force inside. And looking at the castle from the outside, one can't really know how many people inside would violently object to a hostile takeover. So, Dalen has absolutely no way of knowing if he can take the city or not. That's why his bragging about it doesn't come off as a confidence of a professional, but rather as an arrogance of a moron. Then we get this duel stuff. Basically, Paradan wants to duel somebody, anybody, and Dalen, to dissuade him, challenges him to a fight. There is a lengthy argument whether they should fight or not, but eventually they do. Now, the duel itself goes on for a very long time in terms of pages, so let me just give you a short excerpt. Paradan tried to counter with a diagonal strike from Wrath, a type of riposte meant to parry and place his sword on point for a counter thrust. Dalen stepped to his right. It was more of a stumble, but he expected his body to move like this, which was no matter as the fight was already over. By stepping and raising his sword into a hanging parry, angled down, Dalen deflected the strike to his side and stepped forward, positioning himself inside Paradan's guard. Did you get anything from this? Because I didn't. The author claims that at this point the fight was over, but in fact it takes about half a page for the fight to actually be over. Here is how a professional writes a sword fight. The first thug attacked with a feint from Dexter, only to jump aside and allow the man behind him to execute a deceptive thrust. Geralt spun in a pirouette, evaded and passed by them, and with the very tip of his sword slashed the other one from behind across the occiput's shoulders and back. He was angry and hit hard. A fountain of blood spurted on the wall. Less words, much more movement, and at the end of that paragraph, one man is dead. We feel raw emotions in the fight, and we can practically taste that blood in the air. We see Geralt's superior skill in action. Or, in a different book, we have a Romanian officer, Colonel Lucan, fight with a French journalist, Charles Paladin. We don't even see that fight. Instead, it's recounted by another character. Just imagine the scene. A dark, shady courtyard. The broad flagstones lit by lanterns. We spectators are up on the gallery with only Paladin and Luke down below. The Romanian vaults to and fro, brandishes his saber and tracing out a figure 8 in the air, tosses up an oak leaf and slices it in half. The audience applauds in delight. The Frenchman simply stands there, waiting for our peacock to stop his strutting. And then Luke bounded forward, embellishing the atmosphere with a treble clef, but without even moving from the spot. Paladin leaned his trunk backwards to dodge the blow, and then, with such lightning speed that I couldn't even see how he did it, he flicked the cutting edge of his sword right across the Romanian's throat. Luke gurgled a little, fell flat on his face, jerked his legs a couple of times, and that was it. Retired without a pension. End of the duel. End of the duel indeed. And that's the whole scene, not an excerpt. Even if we didn't know the participants from before, we do get to know them somewhat. We learn not the details of their movements, but what it felt like. And we even get some idea of a narrator as a person. And the thing is, the duel takes a lot of space and achieves very little in this book. Paradon is not, if I understand correctly, an important character, so all that scene does is kinda showcasing Dalen being a badass. Meanwhile, other stories show their characters' badassery much faster. So our heroes keep moving and eventually reach the castle, the city, and Dalen dumps some exposition, thinly veiled as a dialogue with his driver, who basically says, "Oh, is that so?" And "Yeah, that's smart." We also learn that most people on the streets are wearing swords, which goes back to that Dalen's brag about being able to take the city in an hour. As if all those people would just stand back and watch instead of, using their weapons. Given that dueling culture, I would be willing to bet quite a few of them can fight. Also, the book contains a paragraph about ladies in, as it says, frilly dresses who were also wearing swords. And that paragraph states that they had a hole in their garments, allowing a sword to be hidden inside and still drawn if needed. I wonder if Shad ever tried fencing in a frilly dress. I haven't, due to not having a sword, but even Inara, when she tried to teach Mel some fencing, ditches most of her clothes, keeping only a chemise with long slits on the sides that leave her legs exposed. A lady that wants to have a sword on her hip would likely just wear pants. Although I understand that the idea of a proper lady wearing pants might give Shad a heart attack.
You don't have a whip out, pants and halberd.
There is also a weird bit about some ladies using parasol scabbards instead, which makes me question if Shad ever had a sword in his hands. I've seen it in some of his videos, but I'm having second thoughts now. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but swords do have weight. And handheld parasols are made to be extremely light, so that a lady can hold it for a long time on her shoulder or just in her hands without tiring or getting calluses. Proper scabbards are also likely to be heavier than a typical parasol tube just because they're bigger, making it even worse. This makes the impression of an author jumping up and down, excited about finding something that isn't present in the real world but makes sense in his mind because, see, swords are sticks, parasol tubes are sticks. It all fits together. Never mind that probably there is a reason why it's not present in the real world. Let's now review Dalen's plan in full. He hitches a ride to the nearest city, which takes a few hours at least, then finds a ship to take him to a different city, then travels from there to the edge of a continent, which, by the way, floats in the air, and after some quality crying, he finally jumps off the edge. Keep in mind that he's a frail old man. One might think that he could have split it, for example, spending a night in a hotel in one of the cities, or having a proper meal, whatever. He seemingly has tons of money. Anyway, his journey takes 2 chapters, and the plan is not even finished. Talk about convoluted. See, the idea is not to hit ground somewhere below. No, this world apparently is looped. Whatever gets to the bottom of the world and crosses the barrier reappears at the top. As a side note, the existence of this barrier is kind of annoying for anyone who loves topology like me. See, a proper cylinder, for example, does not have a designated line where the loop closes. All places of a cylinder are the same. But you know what does have such a designated line? An RPG map. I'm pretty sure that's what this world is. Nothing more than a glorified RPG map. Anyway, apparently crossing the barrier would be deadly under certain conditions. Dalen overdoes those conditions and not only not dies, but becomes young again and even gains some magical powers. And he cries about it because of course he does. Then there is a very long scene with him learning about his aforementioned powers. That scene is honestly terrible because he thinks of a question about what his powers can do, then tests it and just gets a conclusion. Rinse and repeat. The only time he's even mildly inconvenienced is when he tries to improve his hearing and it gets overwhelmed for a second. Everything else is try success, try success, try success. Nothing ever goes wrong. It might be good for a dungeon master explaining how his world works before the party starts on their quest, but for a book it's extremely boring. I'm reminded of another book, Off to Be a Wizard by Scott Meyer. It's not a book I particularly liked, but that part about a guy discovering and testing his new magical powers is done extremely well. For example, when Meyer's character tries to teleport just a tiny bit, he succeeds in teleporting himself, but not teleporting the chair he was sitting on. So he ends up in a sitting position with no support, flops to the floor, hurts his butt. He tries to teleport much farther, this time standing up, and finds out that he didn't take with him the equipment necessary to teleport back, so he has to walk. Essentially, we get try-failure adjustment cycle, which is far more entertaining than a string of successes. So, Dalen eventually figures out how to use his powers to get back to the continent and not die in the process. Then he cries a bit more, and that's pretty much where the 3 chapters end. Dalen goes on with his adventures, and I can't care less. This book is a piece of shit. And honestly, that's great. That's all I have to say. We'll see you next time. Bye.